Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm Elizabeth Schwab, the podcast editor and member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community settings. For the second half of our program today, I'm joined by Ava Kreutziger from HRE USA and three student activists, Ella Henry, an immigrant rights advocate, Jaya Field, a human rights researcher, and Jude Armstrong, a writer and abolitionist. Together, we'll discuss how education shaped their activism and what it would take for schools to uphold freedom of expression and dignity.
We're going to switch now to Jaya's personal spotlight. So, Jaya, you mentioned some of your work abroad and some of your research on queer rights. Specifically, you worked in Sweden and Poland, and you've mentioned you've seen how governments shape public perception through education. Can you describe your research and then discuss any parallels you see in current U.S. censorship debates?
Yes, I will try and sum up the research without rambling. So call me out if you need clarification or if I'm going on a tangent. But basically, what my research examined was the fact that at the regional level, the European Union enshrines queer rights in their framework. However, within the EU, countries vary really significantly in the extent to which they actually fulfill queer rights. So I picked Sweden and Poland because they're kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum of treating queer communities, where Sweden is one of the safest European countries for queer people and Poland is one of the worst. So my research revealed several factors that led to these very different outcomes. And one of the big differences was that in Sweden, their economy has always been very strong, like the Scandinavian middle way, which allowed people to trust in the government and in democracy. Whereas in Poland, because they transitioned out of communism so recently, and it was a really rough transition, one scholar calls it transition losers, that the transition basically created entire populations that were disenfranchised and then kind of felt disillusioned by democracy because they were left out of the transition. Because of this, right-wing populism was able to thrive in Poland, which of course leads to scapegoating of minority groups. And I think the clear parallel between this finding and the US currently is that when people are disillusioned by the government and the economy, they feel personally targeted and they feel wronged. It's really easy to scapegoat minority groups and make people believe that they are the problem and they are the reason that these vulnerable groups are suffering. And so those vulnerable groups can be anything, trans people, immigrants, persons with disabilities. But I think that there's a very clear parallel between this outcome in Poland and the US currently because right-wing populism is thriving in both.
Thank you so much. And then I guess in connection to that, also in relation, your work with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability looked at who is excluded from public life. And in U.S. schools, whose dignity and participation would you say are most at risk when curriculum on identity or injustice is restricted and or stripped away?
Yeah, I think that schools are one of the places where infrastructures of inequality are most prevalent. If you think about it through a disability lens, I'm sure this is true for everyone here, but it's pretty common that students with disabilities are entirely segregated from their peers and they're in different classrooms. A lot of the time, you graduate without even knowing the names of those students. And so I think also just with income inequality, it's extremely visible in schools. And so there are a lot of different ways that marginalized groups can feel very alienated, especially when it comes to just being in spaces. Like it causes a lot of students to not seek out higher education if they feel they aren't represented in their curriculum or just even in simple places like the lunchroom. So there's a lot at stake when it comes to stripping down curriculum that's on identity. And I think that's because there are very physical ways in which that injustice manifests.
Thank you so much, Jaya. You did not ramble whatsoever. And thank you for trying to sum up the many amazing things you've done in such a restricted time period. So now, Jude, could you tell everyone a bit about the research paper you wrote on incarceration systems in education?
Yeah, so in high school, I had to write a research paper. I wrote mine poetry that's written by formerly incarcerated people about incarceration, connection of that with how we should approach achieving prison abolition. And I looked at, and a large part of it was an education aspect and looking at literacy programs and writing programs. And that is one of the ways in which we move towards abolition is through education, because that is an empowering thing.
Yeah. And one of your quotes in the research paper is education, when it empowers the disenfranchised, is criminalized. How do you see this principle operating in current book bans and restrictions on discussing race, gender, and sexuality in schools?
I mean, I think it's a good question because they come from a very similar place. In fact, like some of the books that are banned in schools now are also banned in prison. Of course, that varies state by state. Books have always been kind of the first to go, especially we can sort of track other sort of social developments along with the lighting of books. So in the 70s, there were a lot of prisoner riots and strikes going on, and immediately right after that, books were taken away at a lot of prisons, not just prisons that strikes would happen at. And then I think we see now there's been this new awareness of gender and of trans people, and that has also been met with a sort of pulling back of books about that subject. And then I think the bans at their one of the most dangerous things that I think they do, especially when we're talking about kids in school, non-college students, it serves to justify sort of like a policing aspect, right? Teachers are no longer in charge of course materials or able to sort of like guide their students through their own learning. Is replaced by an outside observer, usually from the state, which at least in New Orleans is very blue city, but the state overall is very red. So those two can clash sometimes, but it sort of takes autonomy away from the teacher in being able to do that. And then you have an outside operator that adds another level of policing to high school students.
Thank you. And then also, I guess, in connection to that, on a larger level, your activism and writing has very much so been focused on human dignity inside the incarceration systems and how they're designated to dehumanize. So how has your own schooling, would you say, shaped your understanding of whose voices are considered legitimate and then whose are silenced?
This ties a lot into what Jaya was just talking about with looking at these classrooms are also representative of all these larger social patterns. We can see, so like girls being spoken of are more than boys. Especially like in classroom discussions. At my school, it was very common for Black kids to get more detentions, easier to get detentions. Sort of like there were issues with dress code being applied unfairly. So I think sort of seeing that and experiencing that taught me and told me that like you need to look in the margins. You need to look for the voices that aren't there. And that ends up tying in a lot with incarceration, just because communication outside prisons is so limited, and it's really hard to have a voice and to get a voice while you're incarcerated. I think I had to look for the silence. Both people in the classroom didn't have a voice, and also people now who don't really have that.
The way you phrased that was very impactful, Jude. You have to look for the silence. Thank you for sharing a bit about your work. So now we're going to turn to two more questions to ask everybody before we end this episode. So we'll just go around again. And this is helping us look a bit into the future, which we've already, that's been an ongoing and reoccurring topic this episode of so much still existing in the present and ways we can use human rights education as a tool to control what we can and spread knowledge as truthfully and accurately as possible. So, Ella, we'll start with you. If you could place one specific resource into every U.S. public school, a book you read or wish you had read, a training experience in which you've participated, or a conversation you've had that would directly challenge censorship, what would it be? And what impact do you think it would have on the students?
That's a great question. I think that if I could do that, I would. So many books come to mind, but I first think of theories of intersectionality and critical race theory as being essential things and theories to learn about. Like I've said, I grew up somewhere predominantly white, very rural, very conservative. Intersectionality, critical race theory weren't ever words that were mentioned. I think now, as someone who is in the process of getting a higher education, I realize the importance of understanding the intersectionality between different human rights issues, between race and gender and economic class, and nationality status and immigration status. And I understand the importance of grounding education in race and the idea that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are more disproportionately impacted by so many of the human rights injustices that we've talked about. This past spring, I was in a writing class at Columbia that was centered on race and ethnicity. And for the first time, I was learning about Black feminist scholarship and Black feminist thought, and as a framework for the rest of the information that we were learning about. I think that grounding information from the perspective of a Black woman was so empowering and so new to me, where I had always learned about history from the perspective of a white man. I've never first learned about something from a perspective of a Black woman. And so for that to be the case this past spring was the coolest thing to me ever and so empowering. And I learned so much and I grew so much. And I think that having that opportunity to be able to reshape the way that education is taught and formed is very empowering and important.
Thank you, Ella. Yeah, Jaya, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Similarly, I think something I've experienced in college that I think would be really beneficial for U.S. public schools. I think it was sophomore year of college. I had this really incredible professor who basically organized a letter writing relationship. So she was teaching a parallel class at the local women's prison. And so what she had happen was students in her class at the University of Washington would write letters back and forth with women that were taking the same class within the prison. And just something that simple, where I think in a lot of like educational settings, you can just be around people that are very, very similar to you. Like you have more in common than you have different. And so it's very powerful to see the humanity in people that are within prisons, which is something a lot of people don't do naturally or think about. And even for myself, like, obviously, I would think of myself as like an empathetic and like socially conscious person, but to be in conversation with someone that is kind of in your same position, but within a prison is so eye-opening. And something else that we did in a class I took this past winter quarter, it was a class on human rights in Latin America. And there was a practicum section of the class, which is how I got involved with migrant justice organizing. But something that we would do in the practicum was to have calls with people that were within the local detention center. And oftentimes it would require a translator or something like that. But again, just to be in dialogue with people discourages censorship, because people do not censor their own life and life experiences when they're talking to you. And it can be hard, like it's uncomfortable at first. I felt that a lot when I studied abroad for the first time in Peru, where there's a language barrier. It's really scary. It makes you feel kind of guilty in a way to recognize your immense privilege when you're talking to someone that has a completely different background from you. And so I think that any programs like this in high school would be so beneficial, because it is really uncomfortable. And because it's uncomfortable, it forces you to look inwards when you do just talk to people that are very different from you. That's kind of a resource I would implement, because I feel that way in college as well, where as much as you read about, theory, framework, stuff like that, it's so much more impactful to just talk to people.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd say my most impactful educational experiences really do root in conversations with people and learning from listening. But yeah, Jude, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I think I had to pick like one book. I think that it would probably be Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis. I think that book, it's very expansive in what it covers, and it really does take charge of talking about the concept of criminality, and it challenges it in a very unique way that I don't think a lot of kids are exposed to. And I do think that the book, and of course, and like with even like the concept of prison abolition, is a very radical one. But I think that we need people to be radical. We need kids to be radical, because we won't find freedom or peace in moderating ourselves or centering ourselves. It will be through radical learning, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jude. And so our last question, on human rights and the Declaration on Human Rights, Education, and Training, which we've talked about earlier, says human rights should be learned through lived experience, not just as abstract concepts, which I think we've touched upon throughout this interview. What do you each think it would take for schools to embed this principle in everyday learning? And what training/education would administrators and teachers need to make this happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask, especially as we're trying to emphasize the importance of human rights education. I think in order for something like this to happen, it would require a shift, not just within a curriculum of a school system, but a cultural shift. I think it would a shift towards intentionality, being intentional towards making school spaces inclusive, being intentional about prioritizing diversity and equity and participation and fairness among students across the schools. I think that this could include human rights subjects, human rights themed subjects being promoted. I think it could include encouraging student voice in school decision making and using restorative justice practices instead of punishing students for every single thing they do wrong. I think that similar to what we've discussed and what Jaya was just talking about, I think this involves more real world learning and learning through experience instead of just through theory and through textbooks, whether that be through conversation and through community building and connection making, or through service projects. I think that those real world, real life experiences help engage students and promote the idea that this human right education is not only important, but it's prioritized. I think that for this to succeed, teachers and administrators alike would need not just theoretical understandings of what human rights education is or why it's important, but practical understanding of what it means to be respecting of these rights, what it means to be prioritizing inclusivity and diversity, and to have an anti-bias education, and what all of these things mean, what it means to have trauma-informed practices. I think that for administrators and teachers to know all of those things would be what are necessary in order to help promote this environment that prioritizes human rights and education as a right, which I think is the world that we want to build.
Thank you, Ella. Jaya?
Yeah, something I've been thinking about a lot is that I think so many educators in public schools are really limited by, like, they fear for retaliation if they do push the boundaries a little bit and try to teach with a human rights lens or talk about certain issues. There's often backlash from just the administration or the school board, whoever it is. Something that impacted me a lot recently was one of my favorite high school teachers who I've kind of been referring to a lot because he really did push me into this career I'm in now. But he's Jewish, and he decided to teach about Palestine in still a very conscious way, just, that Palestinians have the right to be free from violence. And he's on leave now because they gave him a strike, and it was this whole thing where a lot of people in the community kind of rallied around him. But I think that that's a really good example of, like, he did try to push the boundaries past how it was when, I was attending that high school a couple of years ago. And I think it's really sad that educators should have to fear that they'll be censored or, face backlash if they do kind of push, the boundaries past what is, the status quo. So I think that for schools to really be able to embed this principle in everyday learning, there would just have to be an environment that was more safe and more conscious of, like, fighting back against populism rather than giving into it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jay and Jude. Do you want to close us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think like what we all talk about, like that change is like hard to make. I think, but what I think is and I observe it is one of the most driving factors in how people um, think about human rights and how they act about human rights, or can sort of think about them in a realer way, is when what Jay was talking about, having those conversations, specifically talking to formerly incarcerated people. I think that like there's more costs than human rights. Than incarceration has more costs than just like a person's life, right? Is involved with so many other factors of how would they write lives, its opportunity, its dignity, its human touch, its education. So I think this would be, while it's important for students to have that, it's also important for adults to have that, right? Because when we're looking for a shift in attitudes towards the human rights, this is something that happens both in the school, but also hopefully across a community or a state or a nation or whatever. And so if we all engage in that practice of connecting with community, and of building an understanding of what human rights is and also why it's important, I think that would probably be the key to unlocking something that allows us to build a better world.
Thank you, Jude. This has been such a truly impactful conversation to listen to and hear about. And I am so lucky to have gotten to speak with each of you today. So thank you.
I'll echo what Ava said. Yeah, it was wonderful to hear your stories and also get, I think, Jude, you just touched upon it at the very end, but the idea of like intergenerational justice. And I think that that's one of the most powerful things about having voices like yours on the podcast, and what we all hope we can foster eventually. So thank you for that.
Thank you for listening to Human Rights Education Now. That concludes our program and conversation with Ella, Jude, and Jaya. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Cast, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, send them to christy@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernakes, executive producer Christy Rodelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Jizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.